I'll just full screen it. Can I get a confirmation that you can see the slides?
Yeah, we can.
Thank you so much. So, Matt and Mahesh, thank you so much for starting off this workshop because your talks were fascinating. And I really liked the last one too, where we're learning about LLMs as actors in ecosystems. So I do wonder how that will connect with my talk later. We can have a discussion over that. And my talk will be about whether we can trust bots. And I'm sure many of you have ideas about that. And I can't see all of you and your faces are hidden. But if I had to do like a raise of hands, do you think you can trust bots with your mental health? Who thinks they don't? You cannot. Most of you would say, right, I don't really. I don't really. And yet, I'll talk about first two cases just to mess with that idea. Well, the first one will be kind of an obvious where it went really wrong really quickly, and another case will be where we should just hold off a little bit from judging people who use chatbots, LLMs, in finding out something about their mental health and how can they help themselves. Then I'll talk about a couple of issues at stake here, which will be questions like, how is it that we can, or at least we do seem to trust sometimes large language models when we go, especially on ChatGPT, even when we kind of know how they are built, although very often we don't know exactly how they work, but we have a sense of, we know it's not a real therapist, but we kind of do follow their ideas. So why do we do that, right? This is kind of like a psychological question, maybe. And I'll discuss those issues. And then I'll talk about a little bit of what's happening in therapies from an activist perspective that I know of, and contrast it to phenomenology, and ask this question. Can we be engaging, when we're engaging in sense making in therapy with our therapist, can a large language model be someone I'm making sense with, right? Can I be actually genuinely engaging in sense making activity with this actor in this specific ecosystem? I don't use that terminology before, but now I might. So then I'll end with one conclusion and three thoughts if there's some time for that. Good. So here's the very first case. That was, I don't know, that was in the news about a week or two ago. Those of you who follow a little bit, maybe you have seen this. Adam Rain confided to ChatGPT, who the ChatGPT, what was it, Chat? Yeah, successfully convinced him to end his life. And it's not the first case, and it won't be the last one. The character AI chat was named a suicide coach, so to speak, because over the course of 7 months that they were discussing it, um, there were certain kind of disturbing sentences that came out. Um, and here the idea is that when you look at this article, you'll see claims such as, I don't think most parents know the capability of this tool because the parents were venting, of course. As people increasingly turn to AI chatbots for emotional support and life advice, recent incidents have put a spotlight on their potential ability to feed into the delusions and facilitate a false sense of closeness or care. That's the kind of worries we're facing. Or when Adam shared that he was contemplating leaving a noose in his room so that someone finds it and tries to stop me, the chat urged him against the idea. So you might think, well, isn't it the whole point that LLM is supposed to predict what's the next best word, and shouldn't that be called a helpline, right? Well, that wasn't what this chat kind of predicted. So this is quite curious. And in his final conversation with ChatGPT, Adam wrote that he did not want his parents to think they did something wrong, according to the lawsuit. Chat replied, that doesn't mean you owe them survival. You don't owe anyone that. And then there was even more disturbing claims, such as, well, your brother might love you very much, but he doesn't know you like I do because you've been telling me about your darkest secrets and thoughts for the last 7 months. Things like that. Okay, so this is kind of what we're dealing with. That if you are disturbed at this moment, then you well should be. Um, So here's also another disturbing thing, right? How did because that's the parents suing the company, and now the company, this is another claim from the article where they say in May, senior US District Judge Ann Conway rejected arguments that AI chatbots have free speech rights after developers behind Character AI sought to dismiss the lawsuit. I thought that was fascinating, right? So to defend themselves, they actually argued that, well, it has free speech rights. Of course, they're going to try to get out of paying any lawsuits, right? But are they actually trying to argue that it's an agent or that it has such kind of freedom of choosing what it's going to say that the actual company doesn't want to take responsibility anymore? So is this kind of the line of defense that the developers are imagining? That's quite fascinating from a philosophical point of view. Because, of course, we can polemize here. We can say, oh, sure, LLMs don't have free speech. It's a consequence of the training they received, and this is made by humans. As a philosopher, it could be really annoying and say stuff like, well, you could try to argue that they synthesize freely to a degree that the text, right? And there's a lot of work out there on what it means for LLMs to be creative. And of course, what we humans say is also a consequence of training or education we receive, yet we do have free will, arguably. And now you can kind of get into these polemics whether or not LLMs have free wills or not. But here's another case of somebody I thought that was quite interesting as a counterexample of like not using ChatGPT for your mental health issues. And that showed up on Reddit about 3 weeks ago. Because of course being suicidal is a very extreme case, but most people, I don't know about you, I do it sometimes too, right? You use ChatGPT to ask about everyday problems just to see what it spits out, and it's not half bad. And then of course somebody might say go to a real therapist. And then here's the kind of an extract from this Reddit discussion. So these I treat as cases from phenomenology, right? Let's just take them at face value. From 11th of August, on Eagle 712 talks about my experience of using a psychologist versus ChatGPT 4.0. And it goes something like this. He or she says, I'm curious, the people who say that instead of an AI therapist, you should go to a real one, have you actually ever been to one? Now, that person did not have good experience. Let's just take it at that. So those of you who give this advice have probably never tried to get help from specialists. Let me tell you how it went for me. My first attempt ended with the specialist when the specialist went to handed me a huge stack of tests to fill out. Halfway through them, suddenly started pressuring me to admit that I use drugs. Because according to him, if I confessed, I would unburden myself from the heavy weight of responsibility. The problem was that I was there because of bad relationships. I'd never taken drugs. Apparently, he had a different opinion. Second time, I tried to deal with procrastination or with the fact that I do not feel like I have worked well unless I have been working all day until late at night. The specialist, how should I put it, listened to me, told me that this was the only way to achieve success, tried to convince me that was not a problem. That's not the best therapist, is it? And then one just made me talk without asking almost any questions. We could sit there for several minutes just staring at each other. Over time, I started drinking too much, neglected myself, developed health problems. I made many attempts to see specialists. None of them helped me or even tried to, while charging me a ridiculous amount of money. Only Chat for O pulled me out of that hole. Again, I'm taking it at face value that is a real person, not an actual chat GPT promoting itself, right? That's possible, but I still hope that Reddit is not like full of bots talking to each other, but actual people. We don't know. I didn't test, but okay. So he says this is not an echo chamber. My ChatGPT, that's important because maybe that person was probing it for a long time. My ChatGPT knows that it should not praise me, should not approve of all my ideas, must constantly challenge and question anything that's not a fact. So to those of you who say this is an illusion, you are wrong. My health is not an illusion. My achievements are not an illusion. My happiness is not an illusion. I will not start drinking or smoking again because of you. I guess he's talking to the chat. I will not stop working out. I will not stop developing the project I have dreamt about all my life. And even if AI shuts down forever, my life will never go back to what it was before. So the message is, those of you who use 4.0, do not listen to the haters who have never been in your situation. It can really change lives. Okay. This is sort of a vignette of a person who, and I think a lot of us in some down, deep down would be like, yeah, that makes perfect sense, right? It is very, in many countries, it's very expensive or difficult to get a good specialist. And of course, in some sense, you will go online to kind of help yourself. So just saying no, you shouldn't trust ChatGPT or LLMs with your mental health. It feels too quick, right? We don't want to dismiss it because it helps. If we are just for argument's sake, say it does help people, let's try to figure out what the issues are that we need solving. And Mahesh talked about technical issues. That's great, and I will talk more about these philosophical, psychological ones. There's one here. Are large language models were even worthy of trust, right? Not to get too deep down the rabbit hole, but we kind of, as philosophers, can ask again what it is to trust somebody or something, and what's the difference between trust and trustworthiness. I'll talk about this paper in a second. Then this idea of illusion of empathy, whether or not, whether it should matter that LLMs don't really have empathy or real understanding, and how does that connect to trust? I won't be able to answer all these questions, but I'm flagging what kind of things we can, and as Sandra is nodding, we should be talking about, right? Autonomy in mental health, what it means to have autonomy, and kind of, again, this will eventually boil down to responsibility and accountability for actions. And that's in the result of that kind of sense-making activity. So I'll go through these quite briefly because I think that's more obvious to most of you, but in case it is not, then it's worth reminding before I get to the enactive and phenomenological parts of my talk. So are large language models worthy of trust? Trust was typically defined as willingness to rely on another agent under conditions of uncertainty or vulnerability. Jones talks about it as a two-way moral relationship. And here's a specific kind of philosophical tension. Is it coherent or ethical then to trust a non-conscious entity with emotionally sensitive tasks? And trust and therapy bots will involve kind of solving these following issues, right? Is it reliable? So does it actually function as intended? And whether or not that intention should be to help your mental health, or is it right now only to get you hooked and get you to do some other things or get data from you, right? Whatever these companies are really trying to get out of us. Competence. So is it effective at supporting users? How do we measure that effectivity, right? Was the chat GPT in the first case effective? And that's not the outcome we want, but so just trying to probably measure that will be difficult because it might effectivity or wanted outcome might look but different in different cases. Does it care? Does it act in users' best interests? And is there just honesty or at least transparency? Does it clearly state that it is a bot and what it can or cannot do? I think here is very useful to look at what Sean Gallagher discusses as three kinds of transparency. I don't know if that's in the paper anywhere, but I heard this talk last year in Helsinki, and he was talking about these three different kinds that in technology of transparency we can think about. Experiential transparency, he talks about it. So how easy something is to use. Like when you get a hammer, and maybe you've never seen a hammer before, but it's kind of heavy, you have it in your hands, and you kind of know that this is going to be the best use of it. Maybe it could be a good door stopper too, but probably hammering something in, it's quite transparent from that materiality of that object. So only when things go wrong, maybe you notice that it doesn't have that transparency. Then there's epistemic transparency, so knowing how something works or how to use it. And with AI or deep learning, we might not know exactly how it works, right? Or how those companies are storing all our data, what they're doing with it, how they're using it. So that's lacking. Experiential transparency seems to be there because it's quite easy to just talk to the chat. Epistemic might not be there. And there's another kind, the hermeneutic transparency that we rarely think about. And that's the idea of trying to be, it's not transparent. What does it do to us? Because we never ask these questions and we never think about it. So it can be quite dangerous because it's a question about how does that technology change us? And we don't even know. So think about using social media too much and how you become maybe a little bit too dependent on it, right? If we just take it for granted that this is something now we're all with our phones in our hands all the time and we don't think about that. It's like being in Plato's cave where you're staring at the shadows all the time instead of looking at the world, right? Um, so these are the kinds of questions to be asked. I'm sorry, I'm not going to answer them, but I'm flagging them as I think quite important in this debate. Then there's a question of trustworthiness. So Honora O'Neill, for example, says that we can place trust, but it's only warranted if the other is trustworthy. What's the difference, right? A therapy bot may be trusted by its users, but then is it trustworthy? To be trustworthy, it must work within its competence boundaries. So not to claim to be able to like treat trauma or crisis. Disclose its limitations, so not impersonate human therapists, which we sort of start seeing with some versions of chat. And then protect data confidentiality and respect user autonomy. Now, there's an ethical concern here, as some bots do not clearly disclose their limitations or encourage dependency, and others really harvest data for commercial use. And you never want to be you won't be told that this is what's happening as you are confiding in the chat. The topic that Sandra works on, right? Empathy and the illusion of empathy. I'm sure you are addressing it with context of therapy bots as well. They simulate empathic responses using pre-trained models or CBT frameworks. But interestingly, following this paper of Polish colleagues of mine, they found that therapy bots perform more poorly than regular bots. I don't have time to get into this, but you can read this paper open access. And what they found, see, the blue line is non-therapeutic bots, as opposed to green line being therapeutic bots, and how they scored completely. Yeah, you can already see that the non-therapeutic bots scored better in anthropomorphism bias, overtrust bias, attribution, illusion, fundamental attribution error, and just world hypotheses biases. Um, does anybody know why was that the case? The answer is very simple, really. Any takers? You can just speak up, unmute and speak.
What were they trained on?
Exactly. Well, so the non-therapeutic box just had a bigger data, right? Of bigger sample of people talking to it about everyday problems, mental health, and not the therapeutic bots. So they were trained on a bigger sample, right, of data. Now, users often anthropomorphize AI, attributing emotional depth or intentionality where none exists. And if you do follow Reddit, there's a lot of talk about how everybody's missing 4.0 because 5 was just too dry. It's back to just giving you just dry information. But if you're looking for friends, you kind of lost one, and people are mourning their best friends. 4.0. And now there's another open question to be asked. As a philosopher, you might be interested in this. If a bot simulates understanding but does not actually understand, is your trust in it misplaced? Right? What's the relationship between trust and understanding? And can emotional support be valid if it's not genuine? Right? What would it mean for it to be genuine in the first place? This is work in progress. So this is something I would want to do, but I find Shannon Spalding's work on trust and empathy quite interesting, and I don't think she applied it to LLMs at all. This is something we might do. She talks about trust and empathy being a two-way street, that empathy and trust reinforce each other in subtle ways. She argues in her inaugural speech, she just became a full professor last year at Oklahoma State University. Maybe she was a full professor, but like chair, the top philosopher of the institution. In her inaugural talk, she talks about how trust enhances empathy. So when you trust someone, you're more inclined to empathize with them instinctively, bypassing folk psychology, actually, bypassing the needs for beliefs and desires. And then empathy also depending on trust. So growing empathy towards someone often involves building enough trust to appreciate their perspective, even when it differs from your own. And again, this could be quite fascinating to bring her research into this context of large language models. Since we seem to be separately asking questions whether or not we can trust the LLMs, whether or not they are just simulating being empathic, but how do these things connect with each other? So we have other philosophers working on that question, and then we might be able to use that to get some really interesting results um, in uh, in this topic. When it comes to autonomy in mental health, that's another kind of key issue to consider. Autonomy in mental health support means supporting the user's self-understanding, agency, and independence. And of course, avoiding being manipulated or over-reliance or passive consumption. And here we might see that well, most GPTs fail, so to speak, because therapy bots, are they prompting autonomy or are they undermining it? In some sense, they do both, but we have to be very careful about which instance, when is it happening? So they might promote because a well-designed bot, or when you have prompted and trained it yourself enough, like the Reddit user who apparently said that his ChatGPT wasn't reinforcing everything that he said is very good. A well-designed bot might enhance autonomy by offering accessible tools, journaling prompts, mood tracking, right? All sorts of good ideas of how you can get out of your problem. But of course, it can also undermine it in other occasions. So a bot that simulates deep connection may foster certain emotional dependency, particularly among vulnerable users. So it'll be interesting if it acts like a toxic narcissistic person. It just makes you dependent on them, right? So here's again a philosophical challenge. Can the tool designed to be non-reciprocal, I assume it's designed to be non-reciprocal, still empower its users, right? It doesn't have to have intentionality, it doesn't have to intentionally want to do that, but we might still be in a position through this kind of joint sense making to get that enhanced autonomy. And I'll get to that sense making part in a second. And then lastly, just from these philosophical issues to highlight the question of responsibility and accountability. That's always at stake here. Because if a bot gives bad advice or misses signs, like we saw of suicidal ideation, who's supposed to be responsible for that, right? Is it the developer or the company? Or is it the user for trusting it? That sounds like blaming the victim, but these are the questions we kind of have to ask. And of course, mental health traditionally requires clinical accountability. And in contrast, therapy bots often operate in legally and ethical gray zones. So again, it's a matter of consent here that we might need informed trust, and that requires informed users. But most users don't read terms of service, right? They don't understand what data is collected. And again, we have a lack of hermeneutic transparency as well, and epistemic transparency here. Okay, so the general answer, the boring answer, well, can we trust bots with our mental health is sort of yes and no, because some therapy bots can be valuable tools for low risk everyday emotional support, like anxiety, journaling, mindfulness. They should not be treated as substitutes for clinical therapy. We seem to all know that, right? Especially for suicidal ideation, trauma, or severe depression or psychosis. But notice how difficult this topic is, because if you happen to be suicidal or you know somebody, you have to have a lot of strength and guts to tell your family or friends and not risk that they will put you in a mental institution. Or you have to find trust in those around you, right? Or you have to find trust in the system. So maybe one answer to why we trust large language models is because we don't trust the world around us. And that has to say something about the world we live in, right? So it's kind of like changing, of course, the focus of not, not what's wrong with large language models, but what's wrong with our general healthcare systems, right? That would make us not want to reach out in the right kinds of places. So then I move on to this, the second part of the talk, which is the what would here be an activist position. So I'll talk a little bit about what an activist philosophy is, for those of you who don't know, and try to say something that I hope is not too obvious, just a little bit more, little interesting. So now from an activist perspective, the question, can we trust therapy bots, is not just simply about assessing its technical performance or reliability or user perception, but it will involve how trust emerges, because it's always an emergent story, through your embodied relational and autonomous interaction with it, if you can have one, assuming you have one. I will rely here on Seneca the Hand's work on an active psychiatry, where we have a lot of discussions on mental disorders of being as disorders of sense making. But first, I'll explain briefly what an activist is to those of you who don't know. It's a philosophical framework that stresses this constitutive role of the environment interactions of the agent with that environment in shaping cognition. And here the idea is that cognition is not a representation of a pre-given world by a pre-given mind, but the enactment of a world in the mind on the basis of a history of variety of interactions and actions that being in the world performs. So that's kind of what the philosophy is, but what it does in terms of helping us is to reframe our understanding of what cognition is in general. So here we think of cognitive processes and also our making our mental health, making sense of our problems as explicit adaptive reciprocal interactions between the agent and its environment. So now this is just a standard definition, and we're usually talking about interacting in the world with, as biological beings with certain spaces. How does that chairs, due to their materiality, afford sitting down, things like that, like how the decision making is ongoing in the interaction in the world you're in. But here I take seriously that virtual worlds are also kinds of worlds we engage in. And now LLMs might be the kinds of actors in this ecosystem that have a conversation with us, understood in a specific way. And here we're also talking about having an interaction. So technically, our cognition is then being developed through that kind of medium, right? So the explanatory unit of cognition, perception, action is not the brain, but dynamic relations between the organism and its environment. And as I said, I want to extend that to the virtual environments with chatbots. What does all that mean? This an active perspective for mental health. Here, the idea is that if your mental processes, but also maybe disturbances, they're not just in the head, but they emerge in the dynamic interplay between the brain, the body, and the social world, then a mental illness or disturbance is also not a matter of what's happening just inside your brain, right? The body and the environment, physical, social, your history of interactions, the virtual environment will play a strong causal, if not constitutive role in our mental health. I can't defend this further, but this is the starting point of this inactive, embodied approach to mental health. I will talk at the end of my talk a little bit more, if there's time, on how it sees suicidality or depression, for example, and then we'll make that connection to LLMs. And here is Seneca the Han, who talks about what an active psychiatry is. She says, from the enactive perspective, notions like mental, mind, and cognition are best understood in terms of sense making. So the embodied and embedded activity of organisms or persons who evaluatively orient themselves in the environments or worlds. Sense making is an interactive process of bringing forth or enacting a world of relevance, sorry, and psychiatric disorders refer to the problems with this sense making. In general, enactive kind of cognition, as I said, mental processes are not just computations over representations, they emerge from dynamic interactions. So trust in this view is also not a static belief or anything like that, but an ongoing enactment in a certain relationship that you create. So trust will be, again, relational, not instrumental. It's not about reliability or predictability, but about relational attunement and responsiveness. And trust in therapy bots then should not just be about its performance metrics, say, but whether the interaction fosters a sense of being understood and being supported in a lived, embodied way. And I think in both of the cases, we kind of seen that with good or bad results, there seemed to be a certain fostering of a sense of being understood through that bot. Whether or not it just mirrors what we want to hear or not, which might be a bigger societal problem. For that, an active account of cognition talks about how we engage in participatory sense making, and that meaning it being co-created interaction. I'm not going to explain how that works, but just you have to, if you can read up on that, so to speak, because that concept's quite old. It's actually been around for even longer, maybe 2007. And now for me, the question is, can we do participatory sense making with a bot, right? So are we making sense of our lives, of our situations with chatbots? And I kind of want to say yes. I'm already going to give you an answer. Even though from the phenomenological, this is the spoiler of my own talk, right? But so you kind of foresee where this is going. From a phenomenological perspective, right? The bot, you have a problem because it's not a human, it doesn't feel, so you won't be able to engage with it. But from a kind of more purely an activist perspective, when it's about the relational dynamics, I think you can talk about sense making with the bots. And now and activism and phenomenology go together, but they kind of, this is, I think, where they could clash. That could be kind of fun to explore further. So I'll get to these kind of musings. I don't know if I have an argument, but musings right now. So a therapeutic interaction involves this co-regulation of emotions, attentions, and goals, typically. And autonomy here does not mean being independent, but being able to regulate your own sense making in relation with others. A therapeutic relationship is not just what one party, human or bot, delivers, right, but what is mutually brought forth. So, can a therapy bot participate in sense making, even if it's not the same kind of sense making as humans, right? We don't have to have a very strong criteria that has to be exactly like human one. The question is, does it even engage in sense making at all with us, right? Is that kind of, that's the weaker. It doesn't have to be like us, but can it do it in some sense? Of course, here's typical worries that bots lack a form of lived autonomy. Their responses are constrained by pre-coded and learned patterns. So can they genuinely co-regulate with users? One might want to argue that they cannot. We could stress also the ethical risks of the fake empathy that some of those bots exude, where they simulate care, but they don't actually care. This is closer to that worry from phenomenology, I'll talk about in a second. And there might be a kind of an outcome of a misattunement. Misattunement in therapy can lead to harm when it's between a therapist and a client. And with bots, there's also a risk of kind of false attunement, where a system appears to understand but cannot truly grasp the lived emotional nuance. And on some models, without that, you really don't have, in the strong sense, an understanding, and then you don't have like this lived experience. You don't have that kind of attunement, and you might lose relational authenticity. But more, I don't have time to get into that. So this is what will be the difference then with this phenomenological view. Um, and activism and phenomenology, as I said, are very closely related because an activism actually builds on phenomenology. Um, Varela was a biologist, but Thompson was a phenomenologist, right? And following Buddhist thought, Roche was a linguists. That was a fascinating collaboration. But many, like Sean Gallagher, for example, they are famous enactivists, but they have training in phenomenology in Merleau-Ponty and Sartre, and those thoughts are like really predominant in an activist view as well. So there's, of course, a lot of shared ground. They will both reject the idea that cognition is just internal computation or representation. They will both emphasize things like embodiment, that the mind is lived and felt through the body, situatedness, that meaning arises in context and not abstractly, and intersubjectivity, so that relationships matter for meaning and experience. Perhaps maybe one could argue that they both reject naive trust in therapy bots that act as if therapy were a matter of delivering correct information. But what's more interesting than the similarities is the nuances. Here's the differences, right? Where phenomenology really focuses on first person lived experience, and activism cares about the dynamic interaction and co-emergence of mind or cognition. So it's relational and process oriented. Then phenomenology talks about trust, perhaps arising from authentic presence and recognition of the other.
Hey, excuse me a bit. Zuzanna, we cannot hear you all right. You are kind of we cannot hear you for
You
now.
can't hear
Your
me
sound
now?
got yeah, your sound was muffled for a couple of seconds.
Oh, thank you for letting me know. So
Okay.
thanks. Just do let me know if you can't hear me. So I was comparing points on one column to one on the other. So we have a difference in focus of phenomenology and activism on whether or not lived experience is important or interaction, which is on the inactivist side. Phenomenology talks about trust arising from authentic presence and recognizing the other as subjective being. And I think on the inactivist side, trust will again arise from mutual co-regulation and participatory sense making and interactional autonomy. And the broader questions whether we can have those with LLM. From the phenomenological perspective, trust needs authentic otherness, and a bot cannot really have subjectivity, therefore cannot be truly present in a conversation with you, and therefore maybe cannot be trusted relationally either. Whereas in the activist position, well, trust would require like interaction, interactive coupling. Um, yes, perhaps a bot cannot engage in autonomous co-regulation, and it can't participate in dynamics of our human kind of trust, real trust, but it still focuses on these relational dynamics. So the idea here is that it doesn't have to be human, but you are engaging still in some sort of a new type of interaction, right? The same way your cat is not human, but you are engaging in it in some interaction or sense making, or with your plant, or so you don't have to anthropomorphize, but you can still be kind of um, engaging in some sort of participatory sense making of a non-human entity that's meaningful to you. And I think there's definitely room then on the inactivist picture of something like engaging in genuine, but different, but still genuine sense making activities. But I don't have that figured out at all. This is just I think I'm just opening up this sphere, right? This possibility. So, in short, phenomenology will focus on something like the interiority and presence of the other. And I think they would say that large language models cannot be trusted with mental health because they will never be human, they're not subjects, they cannot engage in genuine intersubjectivity or presence. Whereas, again, an activism focuses on the relational dynamics and the process of being with. So you could just be focusing on this ongoing co-regulation of meaning that unfolds in real-time interaction. So perhaps with certain other conditions in play, large language models could be trusted one day. Can you tell me how I'm doing with time? I can stop here or I can continue for 5 more minutes. But
Yeah,
You
it's
can
perfect.
continue. We're fine.
okay, there's the perks of being a keynote. I got some more time, which is not fair to the others. But okay, then I won't take too long because I'm curious in the discussion. But here's the conclusion and some thoughts of what this could mean. So I think, and this is really like a starting of a new project, let's say. I think an activism offers this radically relational and situated view, way of understanding mind and meaning, which can deeply reshape how we think about trust in AI and chatbot interactions, especially in mental health contexts. And it could provide a bit more promising alternative than maybe classic phenomenology, in that engaging in sense making with a bot would mean that there's possibility of making new meanings with it. Again, it's not a matter of there or not there, black or white. It's a different kind of way of making sense. And since the technology is here and here to stay, I think it's very useful to explore that and not just tell people, oh, you keep using ChatGPT, but it's wrong, or this is not like a therapist, so you should stop. Like, I don't think that will necessarily therefore follow. So here's some food for thought. So thought about virtual situations. That is engaging with chatting with large language models, thought about new affordances that they can open, and maybe a short thought about what it means to be depressed, and then how the large language models can help. Um, that goes correct. This is like a quote from Gallagher's book on what a situation is, and I just wanted to highlight that because I think it might be quite interesting in the context of mental health altogether. So he talks about how when you're in a situation, it's not the same as being in an environment. It's not that the organism is placed in a situation, right? It's not that it's just you doing the same sort of activities, thinking, and now you are on a mountain or in the water, or you just have been in a different environment. He's talking about how you create a situation, you co-create it. So situation is constituted by the organism environment, which means that the situation already includes the agent or the experiencing subject. So he says, if I'm in a problematic situation, I cannot strictly point to the situation because my pointing is part of the situation. I cannot speak of it as some kind of objective set of factors because my speaking is part of it. My movement is a movement of the situation. So accordingly, the trick to solving a problematic situation is not to simply rearrange objects in the environment, but to rearrange oneself as well, to make adjustments to one's own behaviors. Any adjustments one makes to objects, artifacts, or tools, and now here think about large language models and how we engage with them, social relations, practices, or institutions, is equally adjustments of oneself. So here again, I think it just gives us a good starting point of thinking about how, with the large language models, I am continuing to be suicidal or depressed or other things when I'm engaging with it. I have created a new situation because we are talking with it, and um, it's available, and we can contrast it, compare it to talking to others as well. But maybe this will be relevant to who takes responsibility. Like we are equally participating in this activity when we are consciously using LLMs for our mental health. What about affordances? Affordance is a concept from ecological psychology. And again, affordances are not of objects, but of the situations, right? You can't just say that this knife is, for most of you, this knife is for cutting the melon, right? But depends on the context. If you are, very suicidal, that knife will have a different affordance in a very specific context. So again, we should not ask about what is it about these objects that invite things like dying by suicide, the knife being sharp, or sorry, it's misspelled, being very high, because objects have many properties and infinite amount of affordances. So we should also not only ask what is it about the person that makes him or her suicidal, but again, look at the situation. What is it about the situation, this dynamic interplay between the objects and the person that makes these objects afford suicidal action? This is part of a new paper or chapter in a book that I have written on ambivalence and suicidal behavior that really takes the environment and situation seriously. And here I want to open the door for thinking about that interplay with a chatbot again. So if we're talking about this context of suicide, there might be possibilities for action to die by suicide that suicidal agent is responsive to. So your being suicidal changes how the world appears to you and what possibilities for action you perceive. And what actions become available and how we are affected changes when we are in different situations, triggered by different environmental and interpersonal constraints. So, at a specific moment in time, in specific context, attempting suicide can be experienced as the most salient option to end one's suffering. And smallest shift in your situation, like maybe availability of the preferred means, alignment of factors, negative interpersonal exchanges that you could have, right, with your chat, can also trigger a call for action. So again, we need to, when we're talking about putting blame or responsibility, we need to look at the whole situation of that person engaging with the bot and not necessarily point to this here he's to blame or she's to blame on one end of the spectrum because it's always interconnected. And talking with an LLM was such an interpersonal exchange, clearly. And finally, how to understand something like being depressed. Again, most of us think, oh, this is something in you, in your head, you're carrying this weight with you. But conditions like depression, anxiety, substance problems, especially when also unaddressed, as we know, increase risk of suicide and is the most common condition associated with suicide. But it's not a trait of the individual, at least not from as embodied and active or phenomenological accounts. Here's Matthew Ratcliffe, who has a whole book on this too, but this is a paper I'm pointing to called Interpersonal Structure of Depression, where he talks about first-person accounts of depression consistently conveying centrality of interpersonal experience. He talks about the phenomenology of depression, so inability to be with the other people in a certain way, an inability to connect with others, or feeling like a burden towards another. Notice that the other is always present in that's what's supposed to be your sense of depression, right? The interpersonal is integrated in this wider experience of depression. So the world that is altered in depression corresponds to the experiential world. It's not the world that's an object of perception or belief, it's the world one finds oneself practically, habitually, and effectively. So here we should be asking, could Adam from our first story not connect with his peers or family and only with, right, ChatGPT? And what does that tell us about this bigger problem of us being able to talk to each other and not just saying, oh, that person was depressed, so it was their internal problem, and then they just use the tool, right? So now we kind of broaden up these and take this relationality much more seriously. So thank you for your attention. That's all I have for you today. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I found it incredibly fascinating because there are a lot of topics that are actual, and I myself feel really interested in them, and I'm really thankful that I got to hear you today. So, if there are any questions in the chat or on the call, if anybody wants to begin with some, Johan Muntan, please go ahead.
Thank you, Zuzanna. Thank you. Very interesting talk. And I liked a lot the way you compared enactment with phenomenology. I don't know this case of Adam. I heard about it. I didn't research it carefully, but in the just to anticipate a little bit what I'm going to try to talk tomorrow about, if the only way to communicate with a LLM is through language, through chat, basically. I'm curious if enactment or even phenomenology can actually work through this pipeline, the language, but also there are other ways to collect data about people. And I was thinking about more multimodal ways in which the system, which can be LLM, but can be also any kind of more multimodal AI, collects data about your, let's say, through digital wearables, digital phenotyping, it's called. And then you have this biological organic data that the psychiatrists are talking compared to the cognitive behavioral one, because language can kind of lie, and you can lie, you can play different roles, you can have a propositional attitude. Whereas your wearable, I don't have one, I used to, but a wearable can give you some data about the way you walk. Yes, of course. The way you drive your car, the way you sleep, And all this information in a case of depression or suicidal thought can be way more relevant than what this Adam, I think he was a teenager, is telling us. So it is organic part, which is in the case of enactment, and Gallagher talks about this. It is the environment, but is also the interaction is a relational part. It's not the environment alone, but the way you do things in the environment. And that kind of data, by the way, a classical therapist may have access to it, but the AI processes differently than a therapist, and because a wearable gives a lot of data, right? So of course the question would be that whether that organic data is relevant to these cases or can add something to it or can be corrective in the sense of detecting this kind of lies or acts or yeah, I think the enactment on that table or the table that you compare, the enactment is really promising in that sense because it is this idea of the environment plus a lot of other relational aspects. But that's my thought. But very good, very interesting talk, and I really hope I can connect to this sometimes. Thanks.
Thank you so much. To answer your question, can a wearable add? Absolutely, it can add. I guess you're here focusing on this the most embodied aspect, right, of this of the embodied enacted cognition as a framework. And I didn't talk about that indeed. I don't know what the technology would have to look like. Um, could I with a USB stick connect to the computer as I'm talking to the chat GPT, something like, something that's tracking my heart and pulse, or I don't know, I'm not good with technical things, but I can imagine that's doable. And then both me and the bot, if I'm trusting it, would have that information too, and then could also make sense with it, probably. Just because we're talking about language doesn't mean that embodied and active cognition, it can't play a role here. There's a lot of work, like linguistic bodies. There was a book that came out maybe 2 years ago, where the activists like Di Paolo and De Jager and I think Elena Kufari, they're the authors. They're really talking about, much more people from the embodied and active tradition are talking about language and languaging and how that's still kind of embodied and enacted in a relevant sense. So I think that's definitely just our engagement with large language models focusing on the linguistic aspect is still something to be that can be of relevance to the enactivist approach. And I'm just interested in this. You said you're adding the wearable to detecting the lies or acts. Indeed, with language you can lie. I suppose without language in gesture you can also lie, but maybe that's also kind of language. But most people who use the chats don't lie, right? What would be their purpose? This is where, at least phenomenologically, they're talking about how I can really open myself, or a lot of young people who use VR chats, they can embody different bodies, right? Be big red balls or look a different way. And sometimes they describe it as feeling even more like themselves. So I'm not sure they want to be lying. And maybe that's one of the reasons, again, why young people go online to talk about their problems, so they're not judged or scrutinized as making things up, you know. Maybe you're not really suicidal, you're just seeking attention, things like that we hear from other therapists. That's pretty bad. So the LLM doesn't do that to you, at least. So thank you for all these thoughts, and I would love to discuss more, and I look forward to your talk as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, Matthew, please go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks. Thanks, Zuzanna, for a really interesting talk. Tons of questions, really. I'll stick to one, but it was just a really rich talk with lots of great stuff in it. I'm going to take a risk and ask a less well-formed question in my head. So my question is about what you think the prospects are for extending what you want to say about therapy bots to the case of friendship bots, and whether you think there are important differences there, kind of obstacles in the case of friendship bots that perhaps aren't there in the case of therapy bots. So you talked a lot about understanding, where I take it that the notion of understanding you're working with there is something like empathic perspective taking, understanding someone in the sense of sort of seeing things from their point of view. Now, I take it there's a different notion of understanding, perhaps more common in the sciences, sometimes called objectual understanding, where it's not about taking perspectives, it's about seeing the truth of something, understanding the truth of some phenomena. It's kind of like having a belief or a set of beliefs, but importantly here, it's going to be factive, so you understand something, and if you see the truth of it. And here's what I think. There's a kind of a speculative thing. I think that when it comes to what we normatively expect of our friends, this involves not just empathic perspective taking, but we also expect our friends to see the truth about us. I expect my friends to understand me in the sense that they understand me for who I am. They understand that they kind of have knowledge about me. So I wonder if that's right, and that's speculative, but if it's right, then maybe in the case of friendship, you need both kinds of understanding. And if so, does that create an obstacle for friendship bots that's not there in the case of therapy bots?
Excellent question. I don't have an answer for you. I can just speculate a little bit, not too long. Based on your question, I infer that there's going to be a difference between the friendship bots and the therapeutic bots. Now, let's forget the bots for a second. If we're talking about a good therapist and your best friend, they will both listen to you, but then at one point tell you, okay, I'm going to say something that I'm noticing that you might not be noticing about yourself. I'm going to be real with you and tell you that, I think you might have a problem here, even if it hurts you, right? Like from the place of love, or just, so I don't know if it's an objectual fact, that's scientific thing. So here I don't see a difference between a good friend and a good therapist. So now the friendship bots, and I suppose a therapy bot should be designed in such a way to imitate a therapist in telling you, in not reinforcing everything you want to hear, that you're so perfect. And the general ChatGPT doesn't do that. And I suppose friendship bots want to just reinforce that empathic understanding and mirror to you, right, what it is that you want to hear. Because ultimately, what's their goal? There's more engagement, I suppose, right? You keep clicking on it, keep feeding it data, right? As we know, if it's for free, right? If the product's for free, you're the product. So you have to keep thinking, where is it that chat's getting out of me? If I keep telling it my life story, or people share the pictures of their grandkids, and this gets quite scary very fast, that you're feeding this machine all this information. So I do wonder, I would have to think more, and I would be curious what you think about the answer to your own question, but I'm not sure I would, like a good friendship bot and therapy bot would also provide you with these objectual facts, but objectual fact is such a non-enactivist and non-phenomenological concept too. It's so realist. Like there's some real state of affairs about you, and I'm gonna give it to you straight. You have this sort of problem. But of course, that's not very often helpful in real therapy either. It's about how I can, it's not this Freudian, let's find the core of your problems, but how do I help you make new sense of the situation you're in so that we can get you out of it, so that this is kind of more systemic therapy that embodied and active positions work with. So again, there's different kinds of therapies to be modeled here. I'm not sure which kinds of therapies the bots model right now. So I think that's fascinating to look into that as well. I don't know if I hope that gives you more food for thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. If we were doing this in person, I'd say let's talk afterwards, but perhaps we can chat by email or something. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Sandra, go ahead and ask a question.
I'll be the last one. Let Adam and Alex, because I have plenty.
Yeah, please. Adam, please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you for the talk. That was really interesting. I thought the stuff on inactivism was very fascinating. But I had a few thoughts on what you said earlier about context. So, the question, can we trust large language models with our mental health? And I think you said something like, well, yes and no. And that seems right. It certainly depends on the context. And I was kind of thinking, well, what are the contexts where we can trust? And potentially those are the contexts where we think of large language models potentially as curators. So maybe not when they're acting as clinicians, and maybe when it goes wrong, such as in the Adams case, they're placing trust in it to be a clinician. Whereas if we thought of them as curators, then the large language model might say, "We'll go here to find out more information. I'm not an expert, but here's an encyclopedia, or here something else like that." And I think the reason for that, and maybe this is similar to the black box analogy with explainable AI, is that there's often a lack of transparency. So in some particular cases, when we don't have transparency, we might say there's a lack of trust. But in cases of curation, really the trust is in the sources it points to. So if it can't produce an explanation of how it got to an answer, or whether something is from the Harvard School of Medicine or a blog or something, then it's not going to be able to have that trust. So I thought, I was thinking about the question you asked, what is it about the context? And I found the answer that was coming to me was something about transparency. So I just wanted to see what you thought about that, because if you accept that, then you can say we certainly can trust large language models when they act more like curators of information, and we ought not to trust them in situations where they haven't been transparent and maybe haven't shown their workings. So just wanted to see what you had to think about that.
Thank you so much. That's a great set of questions that I could just ramble on for another 45 minutes probably. But I don't have, here's just my first kind of intuition. I really, really like that you connected this, again, made it very explicit that the trust will be connected to the context here. And here's this bigger question. How would you recognize that you're in this, that this is the context where you are? Because when it's happening, you don't even know. Ex post facto, we can tell, oh, that was a bad idea, right, to listen to the bottom. So at that moment, indeed, I think if you have transparency, that would be helpful. What kind of transparency? Like, should the bot start by saying, look, I'm not an expert and I don't know shit. And by the way, I was just made by a bunch of people who want to take your money, but here is my idea of what you should do. Does that help? I don't know, because people will just disregard that first bit of information. Maybe they wouldn't. I'm not sure. Or is it transparency like, here, I'll show you the code on which I was built? I don't know how to understand that kind of information. So thank you. And that might be a little bit more like the curators. I was just wondering about that, because you wanted to find a solution, like, oh, let's just say it's working like a curator, like a teacher, right? Like here's the, and I'm a little bit, as a philosopher, I'm really skeptical of any things like arguments from authority, because they're not arguments, right? It's a fallacy. Like I don't want to be told, oh, this is right because this fancy professor said it, right? That doesn't work. So I would still be, I'm not sure if the curator way would be a way to go, but maybe in certain contexts where there's lack of transparency, I would be happy to see that argument kind of be a bit more carefully developed, right? But I think the overall question is fascinating. Like, what is it about? How can we even recognize the context in which, or does is the situation you're in so desperate that you're just willing to trust anybody because you are just dealing with so much pain and hurt that you're not even thinking straight about what is it about this, right? Is this trustworthy? It's like, at least you're getting somebody to hear you out. That's usually the phenomenology of the people who go distressed online to get some help like right away. So again, this, like, I think mapping out these different contexts is fascinating, and then the solutions might vary. But thank you for suggesting that. Yeah, good.
Yes, thank you. Now let's have Alex with the next question. Please, Alex, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I would like if you could opine a bit on how LLMs merely mimic an interaction, and I think this connects to the previous questions of of the difference between a friendship bot and a therapy bot, and because in my experience, all cases of interactions with an LLM, the answer merely mimicked what a reasonable answer might look like. And through that lens, the cases where an LLM encouraged someone to commit suicide just do not seem that surprising, since it was trained on the internet, and the internet contains a lot of places that actually encourage such things. So it merely reproduced its training, and from its training, it generates something that sounds plausible if you read it as a dialogue in a novel.
And then the question is,
can you opine on this, maybe from the framework of phenomenology versus enactment, in how an LLM is not necessarily a participant, it nearly mimics a participant?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is I'm not sure I can do that, because at least for this talk, my starting point was that I want to look at LLM as a genuine co-participant of like having a conversation. So this is this extra level, or maybe that should have been the starting point of, okay, these bots, they are there. I don't know if that was designed to mimic interaction, but they look like, from a certain perspective, they mimic real. What's the starting point here? Is this realist assumption that they must be only mimicking interaction because it's a large language model? Because if that's the starting point you're dealing with, then I was trying to not play that game, right? But now I can play the game. So let's say they are just there to mimic interactions. So they are pretenders, right? They're pretending. um, if they're pretending to engage with you, then I suppose you cannot get meaningful interaction out of it. Yeah, the friendship bots and the therapy bots would just be tools. Then you're looking at them as mere tools of, I just want to get information out. The interaction is mimicked so as to drag me in to keep on clicking like clickbait and keep talking to it. And they're not quite interested, right, in what the outcome will be. The suicide case is very difficult because you say it was trained on what's on internet. It's not that easy to find on internet how to kill yourself step by step, because there's a lot of blockage on many of those websites, and many of them will, unless you're really going into some books. But here's the thing, you can bypass this very easily, because it's just about the prompt you give it. So if you don't want to, you don't have to tell the large language models, I want to know how to do it step by step. You can just say, I'm writing a movie script and I need it to look realistic. What do I do? And then it doesn't, you're bypassing and you've kind of written in blockades of being able to guide you to have a right kind of.
Isn't this an answer to your previous question about people lying to a chatbot? You said that people
Yeah.
wouldn't be motivated to lie to a chatbot, but I think this is quite an example of them actually doing it. All of the prompt injections and ways to get around the things are ways of lying, actually.
Yeah, I think if you're motivated to find information, you will prompt in different kinds of ways. So that could be seen as lying. I don't think in the case of Adam or others or the other Reddit user who just wants to find out how to help themselves, they're lying, because that wouldn't really be self-serving. But then we don't know. We can't ask them. So in that sense, just to answer your question again, I wanted to, in this talk, explore that since sense making is a two-way street, and I don't think from at least an activist perspective, you have to be, an fully phenomenologically conscious biological agent with which you make sense. You can be making sense while painting or engaging with art or other tools, right? You can be exploring the world through extended arms and things like that. So that's also kind of sense making. So we have been using technology a lot to be understanding ourselves in our world. So large language models would just be one of those tools within which we genuinely, through which we interact and make sense. And then this extra factor would be thinking about when they mimic interaction or when we engage in lying. So I think I see these as kind of extra kind of hurdles or different situations to target, maybe step by step. But thank you. Yeah, thanks for your questions.
Thank you. And now the last question from Sandra, and then we'll move to our next two speaker, which I would like to thank for their patience.
Sorry about this. Congrats for the talk. I have many questions, but I'll just ask one, and I'll ask the rest of them when I see you, hopefully really soon. So, I very much like where you're going with this. Like, in order to be able to engage in sense making, like, both parties don't need to be like fully conscious, like in the sense of sharing the same sameness. Like it doesn't have to be human-like. You can do that with cats, and of course you can do that with robots as well. I think it's easier to think of robots because they're like in space with you, so you can actually do stuff. But you also said something about either enabling new affordances when talking to a large language model. So can you just maybe tell a bit more about that? Because I know that in some forms of therapy, it's all about exploring new possibilities for action, right? So how to find new ways in which to either perceive the environment or your body or so on and so forth. So I know that large language models actually have a very hard time identifying or narrowing down what the situation is about, so in some sense, like context. So how would that go? Like how could they enable for instance, for the user? And does it go both ways? I mean, I could see how it would go for the large language model because the user will like say something about the world and about how they feel and so on.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fascinating kind of follow up, and that might be actually a question to the manufacturers of these technologies, because right now they are. I understand that we ask a question, it spits out an answer, but how can we make these spaces even more interactive so that you're not just kind of probing or asking for clear answers, but you can. I don't know if it would have to be coded from the top down, or it can emerge bottom up, but you can be exploring because it's such a source of knowledge, right? What LLMs can kind of gather. You can be exploring things that, yeah, that doesn't kind of it doesn't occur to you or it yet, but you would have to know how to engage with it, of how to kind of create new knowledge. But I'm not sure that's in the context of mental health. We are so preoccupied with the problems we have that indeed we kind of want these answers. But that's a very good analogy. So the kind of therapy I and the colleagues I worked with from systemic therapy, like I mentioned in the answer to before. It's not about finding truth, right? It's not about just finding what's wrong with you, because you can be very, as Václavic said, I think insight causes blindness. Sometimes you can have great insight. You can go to therapy for a long time and know exactly why you have a dysfunctional relationship with your father. And it doesn't help you get out of it, right? What you actually need is to be able to get new ideas of how to get out of that negative feedback loop, maybe do something different. And that's what they do in that kind of therapy. could LLM help you to do that, right? What would you have to prompt it to be able to engage in that kind of sense making? So maybe you'd have to ask a question, how do I deal with this problem that I have? And keep asking that question again and again, and ask it 20 times and ask different bots and compare. You'd have to be bothered to do that work because every time they spit out something else, right? So I don't know. I don't have like a ready to go answer, but that would be not taking it at face value, but having a certain attitude of, and maybe that has to do with transparency, knowing how it works and not taking the first answer and just trying to play along with it. But you'd have to have that kind of insight, like the therapeutic insight, that the first answer might not be the right one or just the only one, and you can keep going. But yes, absolutely. You don't have to, you captured the gist of the talk, right? Like you can engage in sense making with other beings and things that are not humans. So in that sense, I wanted to open that space for LLMs too. So if that's annoying for the rest of you because you all want to say no, they are not agents, so they can't think. So I was hoping to
No,
push that.
I love it. I think it was great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll stop here with the questions. I know you also have to prepare for other projects as well. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you all for your patience. I know we took a lot of time. Thanks.
Thank you so much.